Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It just feels like we've entered into some kind of surreal world, a parallel universe, a bit like Alice in Wonderland, where words mean whatever we want them to mean, where he's outdoing the Queen, you know, who was having the Queen in Alice in Wonderland, who was thinking 6 impossible things before breakfast. If anybody watching this will just think that this government has lost leave of its senses, it cannot be trying to claim 2 incompatible things are compatible. So I ask him again, will he stop hiding behind the falsehood that legal advice is necessary to clarify the law on this, and tell us how the Prime Minister is going to keep to the law?
Well, I must say, Mr. Speaker, I didn't quite keep up with all the Alice in Wonderland references, but I'm more than happy to discuss this over a cup of tea, as long as we're not considered 2 mad hatters.
2 what?
Mad hatters.
Vernon Coker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Minister, who I think many of us feel has prevaricated with his answers today, can I just ask the Minister again and try what my honourable friend, my right honourable friend from the front bench was asking him? In terms of complying with the law, the Prime Minister is required to send a letter should a deal or a no deal not be agreed by Parliament. The schedule to the bill actually has the letter. That is part of the law. And it starts with, "Dear Mr. President," and it finishes with "Yours sincerely, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom." How on earth can the Minister stand there and say he can comply with the law without reassuring Parliament that in the circumstances that the 2 conditions laid out in the Act are not met, that he can't say at that dispatch box that in those circumstances the Prime Minister would sign the letter which is attached in the schedule to the bill?
Yeah. I've consistently said the Prime Minister will obey the law, but we don't want to get to that position. We want to get to a deal position as early as possible, and that is what we are trying to do. That's what we are mandated to do by the referendum, by the British people, and that's what previous laws have instructed us to do.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker, the Prime Minister hit the nail on the head last night when he described this bill the way he did, because the fact of the matter is he has got 2 choices: go in all sincerity and negotiate a deal which we know will be voted down by those who don't want us to leave the clutches of the EU, or to crawl to Brussels begging to be allowed to stay at the cost of £1 billion a month. Would the Minister not agree with me that if there is such distrust in the Prime Minister, the courageous thing to do would be to allow a general election, allow the people of UK to decide what they think of this humiliating piece of legislation, and if it wasn't for the fact that the scary cats on this side of the House are running away from the electorate, they would do that today?
Minister.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for that intervention, and I do think I should say thank you for what's now appears to be a cross-party consensus that we should have a general election. It's good to see other people, even other honourable friends on the other side of the House, also saying that they would support an election. And a general election will lance the boil that has been festering here in this Commons. We are a divided House, and we are divided not just on normal party lines, but we are crucially dividing ourselves against the nation. And that is only going to be resolved by either delivering Brexit or by going back to the nation and saying, what do you want?
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister this morning has repeatedly told us that his government is focused on a deal. If that is the case, why yesterday did the Prime Minister call for an immediate confidence vote, which would shut down Parliament within 14 days and make voting on a deal impossible?
Minister.
Well, Parliament would be able to vote, the new Parliament would be able to vote on a deal, and negotiations would continue. Ministers remain ministers as we go through the process, and negotiations would continue.
Debbie Abrahams.
I welcome the change in tone from last night, which many people have already said was absolutely appalling. But I have to say I don't find it helpful to question the legitimacy of the EU Withdrawal Act number 2. Can I ask the Minister, is this the basis for the apparent contradictions between what he has said and what he said to my honourable friend, the member for Edinburgh West, last night? Or is there something else?
Minister.
Well, let's be clear. I didn't question the legitimacy of the EU Withdrawal Act. My honourable friend, the member for Stone, questioned it, and I did say there were a number of outcomes within that bill, but I didn't question and had no intention of questioning the legitimacy of a bill that is being passed through the House. We opposed that bill. We lost.
Patrick Grady.
Exactly, Mr. Speaker, because that was the House exercising the sovereignty and taking back the control that the Leavers were so desperate to do. And I don't know what message he thinks it sends, even to Leave voters, when there are questions about whether the government will respect a law that this House has passed. The one thing the House does agree on, the one majority that there is that we do not want to crash out with no deal. So if they really want to get around the Ben Act, the way to do it is actually to agree an extension now, and then we can all have the general election before that extension period ends.
Minister.
Well, all I'll say to that, Mr. Speaker, is it's somewhat amusing to see a member of the SNP defending the sovereignty of this House. Thank you.
Kate Green.
Mr. Speaker, I accept what the Minister says, that the Prime Minister wants to secure a deal. But may I respectfully suggest that the best way for us to do that with our European friends and allies is in a relationship of mutual regard and respect. To talk of the legislation as being a surrender act implies that they are somehow trying to bully us into accepting a deal that will be good for them but bad for us. May I invite the Minister to pass back to the Prime Minister that that language is not only unacceptable in creating divisions in this country, but it also divides us further from our European neighbours.
Without wanting to up the tone of a debate that's been quite consensual, what the Act does, it does surrender some of our negotiating power by matter of fact. It compels the government to do something, reducing the leverage in negotiation. I'm actually seeing that as being part of Department negotiating. It is deeply unhelpful, and it has surrendered some of our powers of negotiation, which make it more likely that we'll get no deal. It's unfortunate. I'm not trying to raise the tone in any way, but just speak factually about what is happening.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker. Am I right in understanding that the British Government has sought and obtained legal advice on how to avoid the provisions of the Ben Bill?
We don't discuss what legal advice has been taken, nor do we discuss the contents of that legal advice, as I've already said in the House.
Martin Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I take this opportunity to welcome the Minister to the dispatch box. We've had a lot of discussion today and intimation about complying with the rule of law. The Section 3 of the Act will oblige the Prime Minister to do something. In the spirit of the law, how will the Prime Minister meet that obligation?
Minister.
The law very clearly lays out the obligations in Section 3 and other sections. I have nothing further to add.
Gavin Newlands.
Mr. Speaker, if, as many of us suspect, that the Prime Minister and Mr Cummings will attempt to navigate a path around the effect of the Ben Act, a feeling that the Minister's answers this morning have not assuaged, what will the Government's response be when the Court of Session in Edinburgh uses its noble vacuum powers to sign the letter seeking extension for him?
Well, I don't think that I'm sharing a secret. It is the Government's intention to navigate its way around the Ben Act by getting a withdrawal agreement and a deal through this House of Commons. That's our plan A.
Lady Herman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I have to tell the Minister I'm extremely concerned that he has indicated that it is acceptable to the Government and to the Prime Minister, for whom he's speaking this morning, that a no deal will be acceptable. Can I just remind the Minister of the very serious consequences of a no deal for Northern Ireland? And I shouldn't need to remind the Minister or indeed the Government. The consequences will be, if there is any hardening of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, it will incentivise dissident Republicans who are already attacking the PSNI, the Police Service of Northern Ireland. It will incentivise them to even greater violence along the border. And with that, there will be a backlash, I suspect, but certainly a reaction from loyalists. I don't predict that with any pleasure at all, but I think that this Government should be aware of the consequences of a no deal in Northern Ireland. It will also embolden. It will embolden. Thank you. It will embolden Sinn Féin to campaign for a border poll in order to take Northern Ireland out of the United Kingdom into United Ireland. The Government needs to be extremely mindful, and for the Minister to imply that it is acceptable that we leave without a deal is absolutely, totally unacceptable.
Minister!
We want to leave with a deal, but no deal is a possibility. I'm very, very aware of the concerns that she raised, and the Government committed to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And in fact, one of the first things I did as a minister was went to Belfast and also went down to visit the border and people that lived around that border. You know, in itself, turning up and looking around doesn't solve the problems, but I am actually very aware and consistently bear these things in mind when looking at negotiations, particularly around the negotiations that are currently happening in relation to the Northern Ireland border, and that will continue to be very important in the Government's machinations.
Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Mr. Speaker, the terms of the Benn Act are very clear, but so too is its intended purpose and spirit. The Minister hasn't been asked today whether the Government and the Prime Minister wanted to comply with the terms of the Act. He's been asked a very specific question as to whether, if by the 19th of October this House hasn't agreed to a deal or a no deal, will he write the letter as set out in the Benn Act asking for an extension? Can he answer yes or no? Because I'm afraid we're just having no clarity at all on that very specific question today.
We will obey the law.
Andrew Slaughter.
Mr. Speaker, Ministers knowingly confusing the Government's negotiating position with the authority of the law as made in Parliament and enforced by the courts. The Prime Minister says without evidence the Supreme Court is wrong, and now he is saying he won't follow a very clear provision in an Act of Parliament. Does the Minister accept that that trivialises and undermines the rule of law?
No, it is not the Government that is causing the confusion. It is the Act itself and the constitutional position we found ourselves in for a number of areas, including the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which means that we can't have a general election and resolve this by going back to the people that have already decided in a referendum. Predecessors of this House fully supported.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to any rational person, the law of the land states that if a government doesn't get a deal through the House of Commons or gets a mandate for no deal, then the government must write a letter on the 19th of October asking for extension. Now, we know the Prime Minister said he won't do it, and the Minister at the dispatch box won't answer yes or no about sending a letter. He just keeps saying obey the letter of the law, and sometimes adds at that time. So without giving away the Convention on the contents of legal advice, will he confirm, yes or no, that the Government is taking legal advice that they think there could be alternatives to not sending that letter and complying with the law?
Successive governments not only don't comment on the detail of advice, but also on the issue of whether legal advice has been taken. So the answer to his question is no, I can't comment on that further.
Justin Mathers.
Mr. Speaker, businesses are telling me that thousands of jobs in my constituency are at risk if there is no deal. But it sounds to me like the Government think that is a price worth paying to get Brexit done by the 31st of October. Is that right?
We've got the highest rate of employment since decades. I myself am specifically responsible for small and medium-sized enterprises in deal and no deal. And what I would say is, while some of the larger businesses are well prepared, there's still more room for further preparations of smaller businesses, and would recommend a contact through the government website, which is absolutely superb and very detailed. Last week I was in Birmingham, and whilst there were some specific issues raised that we're working on, they were impressed with the government's preparations.
Wayne David.
A few moments ago, the Minister said that the Ben Act was unclear. Could he explain to the House why he thinks it's unclear?
Good question.
That's a fair question, but as I've already, it's a fair question, but I'm not necessarily going to give him an answer that he's happy with. I've already said that the government will take legal advice, but that legal advice will be confidential, and that cannot be shared and would not be shared with the House, and that would have been the case when he was an MEP or when he was a minister.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Some countries' governments try to make compliance with the law considerably easier for themselves by making political appointments to the judiciary. Can he please categorically rule out reports that the government is seriously considering political appointments to the judicial bench?
I think that's well beyond my pay grade.
I say, for the benefit of those observing our proceedings as much as for members of the House, there is a notable, though on the whole I think healthy, competition between two honourable members who share the same surname, but whose first name, though Stuart in each case, is spelt in one instance EW and in another instance UA. One is Stuart C. MacDonald, the other is Stuart Malcolm MacDonald. I've called Stuart C. I don't want the honourable gentleman to feel socially excluded in any way. That would be very damaging. I don't want that to happen. Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
I'm very grateful for that, Mr. Speaker. Like the Minister, we are both successors of the late Teddy Taylor. And when Teddy was a Glasgow MP, he was known as the tenement Tory who talked straight. So let me invite him to find his inner Teddy this morning. Are there circumstances in which the Prime Minister will write to Brussels as outlined in the Ben Act?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman enormously for allowing me to pay tribute to my successor. It was a great predecessor. Apologies. It was great disappointment whilst he saw the referendum vote, and I campaigned with him on the referendum vote, and he was in good health at that point, that he's now passed away. Even when we passed that vote, and we knew he was in ill health, but we thought that we would have Brexit by that point. I think, looking down on us, he will be disappointed collectively that the House haven't continued in that light and delivered on the Brexit result.
Ruth George.
Thank you. Minister, this House and the country would have more confidence in the government's both will and ability to do a deal within the rapidly reducing timeframe if we had any evidence of that happening. The Prime Minister's update yesterday contained a lot of criticism of this side of the House, but not a single word on what the actual progress he had made in negotiations in the last few months. Will the government bring a statement to this House of their progress and the abundant options that the Prime Minister has claimed there are?
Minister.
Well, the Prime Minister answered a large number of questions. There was plenty of opportunity when he spoke for over 3¼ hours. I suspect there will be plenty of opportunity to go into more detail on the negotiating strategy over the coming days and weeks.
Clive Efford.
Speaker, the Minister has pointed over this side, suggesting that people who want to remain are going to vote against a deal and will never vote for one. But there are members on his side of the House who would never vote for a deal as well. They've thrown 21 Tory MPs out of their group, some of which have said they would vote for a deal. So can I ask, has the Prime Minister had negotiations with the European Reform Group, some of which are in the Cabinet, and have they signed up to say that they would vote for a deal that he negotiates?
Minister.
The Prime Minister constantly meets and talks to all members of the Conservative Party and other parties.
Sweeney.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister said there would be ample time after an election for any new government to legislate accordingly and to have a vote on a deal or seek an extension. But actually, normally it would take at least 4 weeks for any new government to pass any substantive legislation. So that not just simply reveal that having an election before seeking an extension is simply a bogus device for this government to engineer a no-deal Brexit by default?
No, not at all, but the honourable gentleman is right. It is a highly constrained timetable, but after 3.5 years we only have ourselves to blame collectively as a House.
Richard Bacon.
Mr. Speaker, nearly every question from the other side has used the word if. Does the Minister not feel it's unreasonable to expect him to have a crystal ball and to be able to predict what the situation is that this country will face on the 19th of October? And what complying with the law on the 19th of October will require? And isn't it better that we just accept his assurance that the government will obey the law?
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. A lot could change between now and the 19th, and actually I think providing the clarity that we will obey the law is actually clearer than picking specific laws and saying how we will obey them.
Alex Abel.
Notwithstanding the Minister's last response, he himself said that the plan A is to get a withdrawal agreement agreed with the European Council. That is nearly 3 weeks away, and he also said they're only just at the stage to reopen the withdrawal agreement. If no agreement is reached at the European Council, does he guarantee that this House will have a motion on no deal and give us the opportunity to vote on whether we accept no deal or not?
Well, it's not that negotiations have just restarted. Michel Barnier's mandate to negotiate hasn't formally started, and that can't actually happen formally until the European Council, where effectively all the work will be done. But right from the point of the meeting with Macron and Merkel, there was a step change in meetings, both at Schurfer level, at political level and technical level with the Commission. That was the point that I was trying to make, not that negotiations had only started recently.
Neil Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the start of this urgent question, the Minister quite rightly reiterated your call for greater respect. But one way of being respectful in this House is to be transparent. And quite clearly the Minister has not been transparent in repeated questions about whether or not the Prime Minister will write the letter seeking an extension. So I give the Minister one final opportunity now to be clear and unequivocal in his response, not just hiding behind some form of words about obeying the law and dodging the question, but will he confirm now, if the first two conditions of the Benn Act are not satisfied, will the Prime Minister write the letter seeking that extension, yes or no?
Minister.
I hate to disappoint the honourable gentleman, but we will obey the law.
Thank you. Order. Urgent question. Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Foreign Secretary for an update to the House on protests in Hong Kong.
Thank you. The Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, Secretary Dominic Raab.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the honourable member for Hornsey and Wood Green for her urgent question, and can I also just say that I think on all sides of the House this is an example where we can come together and discuss an issue which is of joint concern across the political spectrum. I remain seriously concerned by the situation in Hong Kong. Protests are now in their 16th week. Millions have exercised their right to peaceful protest. The majority are doing so peacefully and lawfully. However, I know the House will join me in condemning violence that we have seen on the streets of Hong Kong from a minority of those engaged in those protests. It is essential that protests are conducted peacefully and within the law, and that the response of the authorities are proportionate. With that in mind, the United Kingdom supports the one country, two systems model and framework, and of course the rights, freedoms and the high degree of autonomy granted to Hong Kong and its people under the Chinese-British Joint Declaration. That joint declaration was signed by the government of the People's Republic of China and Her Majesty's government in 1984, and the autonomy, the rights and the freedoms it guarantees enshrined in the Hong Kong Basic Law. It remains as valid today as it was when it was signed almost 35 years ago. It is a legally binding international treaty, and we expect China to live up to its obligations under that treaty, and indeed as a permanent member of the UN Security Council under its wider international human rights law obligations and indeed the UN Charter. The UK government believes that a resolution can only be achieved with meaningful political dialogue which builds trust with all the parties on all sides. And I welcome Carrie Lam's formal withdrawal of the extradition bill on the 4th of September, and indeed some of the incremental steps that she has taken to improve the credibility of the Police Complaints Council. The initiative this week from the Hong Kong government to consult with the people it serves will be a first step on the essential path towards a more inclusive political dialogue, one which builds trust with all communities in Hong Kong. In recent weeks, Mr. Speaker, I have spoken to both the Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam and to the Chinese Foreign Minister, State Councillor Wang Yi. I have made clear that the UK continues to support one country, two systems. But I have also made clear our concern about human rights, and in particular the mistreatment of those exercising the right to lawful and peaceful protest. And the concerns of those peaceful protesters should be addressed by political dialogue, not crushed by force. I have also spoken to a wide range of my counterparts internationally, and I welcome the strong statements from our international partners. The Prime Minister raised Hong Kong at the recent G7 meeting, where all G7 partners reaffirmed the importance of the joint declaration and called for an end to violence. We will continue to engage with Hong Kong and the Chinese government, reiterating the fundamental importance of upholding the UK-Chinese joint declaration. Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy is what guarantees its future prosperity and success. It is incumbent on all sides to respect it.
From West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Throughout the summer, Hong Kong has continued to be gripped by protests, with tens of thousands of demonstrators filling the streets each weekend to demand their fundamental rights. Although the Chief Executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, has announced that the controversial bill, the extradition bill, will finally be withdrawn, this, for some, is far too little too late. The level of protest has grown in the face of brutal police repression, and I've been appalled by the way that protesters have been beaten by police officers and gangs rumoured to be associated with the Hong Kong government. Basic democratic freedoms of the press, of the right to assemble and the right to protest are enshrined in the Sino-British Joint Declaration, an internationally recognised treaty to which we are, of course, the signatory. In the past few weeks, protesters have also been gathering outside the British consulate in Hong Kong, demanding that our government do more. Would the Foreign Secretary please tell the House what contact he has had with the Hong Kong government about the ongoing protests in Hong Kong, and specifically on the issue of police brutality? What dialogue he has had with the Hong Kong government to promote a move towards universal suffrage as per the Joint Declaration? What steps the government is taking to support any holders of a British National Overseas Passport, or BNO, in Hong Kong who are facing undue arrest or harassment as a result of taking part in the protests? And finally, when is the next six-monthly report on the Joint Declaration going to be published?
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Honourable Lady for her questions and her interventions on the substance, and also the very constructive way with which she's presented them to the House. Can I also be clear at the outset that I share her concerns about the repression of peaceful protests, mindful, as I've already said, that some of the protests have been violent, and that is unacceptable too. And I also share her concerns to make sure that the right of peaceful protest enshrined in the Joint Declaration is respected on all sides, in Hong Kong and as between us and the Chinese government. I would make a couple of further points, if I may, Mr. Speaker. I think the Joint Declaration, as a bilateral treaty, reflects not just the right of peaceful protest, but it's also reflecting basic international human rights obligations which would apply to China in any event. It is a bilateral expression of those rights, and it's important for not just the people of Hong Kong, but for the wider model that China advocates and which we wish to respect, which is the one country, two systems model. The Honourable Lady asked what contact I'd had with the Chief Executive, Carrie Lam. I spoke to her on the 9th of August at length, and I raised all the issues that I've already expressed, but in particular the disproportionate use of force by the police against the protesters. I also raised the issue of the Police Complaints Council. In line and alongside the withdrawal of the extradition bill, that is something where the government in Hong Kong has taken some steps to try and strengthen and reinforce its impartiality and therefore its credibility. I think we need to test that very carefully and see whether actually it produced an impartial and objective review. On the issue of B&Os, which she rightly raises, and can I thank her for that, of course, the status of B&Os is part of the package that was agreed in terms of the joint declaration. There is no right of permanent residence for UK under the B&O passport, but it is part of the overarching model of one country, two systems, which, at least at this point, we are arguing needs to be respected. But it needs to be respected on all sides, including by China. Finally, on the 6-monthly report, I would hope that to be due at the end of October or November at the latest.
Tom Tugendhat.
Mr. Speaker, again I welcome my right honourable friend for coming to the Chamber today, and my right honourable friend and fellow member of the committee, the honourable member for Hornsey and Wood Green, for raising this important question. Though I appreciate the points that the Secretary of State has already made about B&Os, it is clear that the UK government did take a subtly different position at the time of handover, when certain key members of the administration were granted UK citizenship, in order to give them the confidence to stay on at a moment of, let's face it, trouble and doubt. Would there not be an opportunity now to give people the assurance that they don't have to make urgent decisions now by knowing that their rights will be guaranteed? And could he also perhaps talk to his friend, the Lord Chancellor, about the presence of UK judges in the Court of Final Appeal? Because, of course, we all know that Hong Kong's economy is underwritten by the rule of law, as indeed is ours. And the independence of the judiciary and the ability to have judges who can speak freely and fairly and without threat of influence from Beijing is one of the things that underwrites not just Hong Kong, but also China's economic expansion. So valuing those judges, knowing that they are an integral part of the rule of law, and not just on commercial rights but on civil rights, would seem a very good place for the UK to start.
Can I thank the honourable member, the chair of the Select Committee? He makes a number of very important, powerful points, and I've been reflecting on them and indeed the reports from his committee. Can I just say I will of course pass on his comments in relation to the judiciary to the Secretary of State for Justice, and he makes those points in an important way. And of course they're good for Hong Kong and its reputation and the wider reputation of China as a place that is open to do business. On the issue of B&Os, and I just want to be clear in relation to this, of course the B&O status, which didn't entitle the holders of those passports to right of permanent residence in the UK, was part of the delicate balance and negotiations that were conducted and then concluded at the time of the joint declaration. We are seeking not to change the status of any one part of that package, but rather to press all sides, including the Chinese, to respect the delicate balance reflected in that package. And that is why, for the moment, we will not change or alter the status of the B&Os, but also make sure that in terms of the rights and the entitlements that they are entitled to expect within that status, of course, they'll have our full support.
Helen Goodman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question. I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Hornsey and Wood Green, on securing it. As the Foreign Secretary said, we're now entering the 16th week of this chaos, and there is absolutely no sign of the crisis abating. We continue to witness appalling brutality by the Hong Kong police against the protesters. The abandonment of peaceful methods by some sections of the pro-democracy movement does nothing to help their cause, which we on this side of the House believe is right and just. I wonder if the Foreign Secretary could tell us, has the Hong Kong executive made any progress in setting up the independent inquiry which we have all called for? Secondly, I'd like to ask him whether the Foreign Office got any credible explanation from the Chinese government for the paramilitary forces which were massed on the Hong Kong border over the summer. The announcement that the Hong Kong executive will be formally withdrawing the extradition bill is welcome, but it is too little too late. Peace and normality will only be achieved if the Hong Kong government meets the largely reasonable demands of the protesters and fulfils promises made to Hong Kongers in the Basic Law. This needs to start with democratic reform and moves towards universal suffrage. The Foreign Secretary is the 5th Minister in 4 months to have spoken on the UK's moral and legal responsibility to safeguard the rights of Hong Kong citizens. I'd like to ask him 2 further questions. What are the implications for B&O passport holders of the government's announcement of changes to the rights of students studying in the UK, which we had over the summer? And secondly, what is he going to do to fulfil the UK's obligations to Hong Kong under the joint declaration if the situation does not improve?
Well, can I thank the Honourable Lady for the very measured and careful way that she has responded to this issue. Amidst all of the other Brexit divisions we've got, it's actually rather important that we have some cross-party consensus where it's practicable on this issue, because it allows us to send the clearest signal to our international partners and indeed to Hong Kong and to China in relation to the importance of these issues. So I welcome that. I share her concerns around the issue of peaceful protest. We've expressed those to the Chinese government. I spoke to the Foreign Minister about this. I've also spoken to Carrie Lam. I also think she's right to say that we condemn violence and that risks tainting the protests, which on the whole and by the majority have been conducted in a peaceful way. She asked me about the independent inquiry. So the administration in Hong Kong has not gone the full way that we would like to see them go, but they have taken steps to reform and reinforce the independence of the Police Complaints Council. Whether that's enough, we shall see. What we need to make sure ultimately is that we have the goal of a proper, thorough and objective review of some of the conduct that we saw by the police against those protesters. I share her concern around reports of troops being increased at the border. I think we, both in this House but also across the international community, must be very clear with our Chinese friends and partners about the Rubicon that would be crossed if we saw a major intervention in Hong Kong. And no one wants to see any repeat of what we saw in terms of the tragic circumstances in Tiananmen Square all those years ago. We want China and Hong Kong to move forward, not backwards. She made the point that the extradition bill is not enough, and I share her frustration to see more done in relation to political dialogue. I think, in fairness, it is important to note that there is steps that are taking place this week and indeed today to engage local groups with political dialogue. And as she has said, it is the long-standing view of the UK that there is a transition to universal suffrage for both the elections of the Chief Executive and the Legislative Council, because of course that's provided for in the Hong Kong Basic Law, and that would be the best way to guarantee the stability of Hong Kong, but also to respect one country, two systems, which is advocated by China. There's been no change in the status of B&Os, but I overall would like to share her concerns. There isn't a silver bullet answer to this. We know that the Chinese government will be very mindful of the behaviour and its reputation and what's going on in Hong Kong in the lead up to the anniversary on the 1st of October. What we need to make sure, both in this House but across the international community, is we're seized of this issue, that we're making it very clear to the government of China that we want to respect one country, two systems, but that also needs to be reflected on their side.
Fiona Bruce.
Freedom of speech, including on constitutional matters, is one of the rights enshrined in the Joint Declaration. And yet recently we've seen pressure being exerted on individuals to desist from dialogue on certain issues. Pressure which is completely unacceptable in any country, let alone in Hong Kong, where these rights were enshrined in the Joint Declaration. What can our government do publicly to ensure that the right to free speech is upheld in Hong Kong?
Thank the Honourable Lady and pay tribute to her tenacious efforts to raise the issue of free speech and peaceful protest right around the world. She's a credit to this House, but also all the work she's doing for the party on this. The UK is not just raised the issue of peaceful protest and the right of free speech, mindful that it must be lawful and peacefully conducted. I've done that consistently and will continue to do so, and I know the Prime Minister feels the same way. And as she says, and as I think the Shadow Minister said, we need to see steps towards meaningful political dialogue. We have seen the removal of the extradition bill, and we have now seen the initiative from Hong Kong to consult with the people from across the communities in Hong Kong. That is a first step. But I think we should also recognise and credit the administration in Hong Kong when it takes steps in the right direction. What we now need to see is that followed up with meaningful, inclusive dialogue which can preserve the autonomy of Hong Kong and the one country, two systems approach that China advocates.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Much, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome much of what the Secretary has had to say this morning. And of course, it's important that we recognise the courageous strength of those in Hong Kong who have protested over the past few months. Indeed, this all takes place on the 30th anniversary of the Baltic Way, and what an inspiration it is to see that spirit of the Baltic Way being invoked, standing up for liberty and freedom as they rightly should. The Secretary mentions the legally binding agreement with China, and whilst it's not for me to defend old empires, he is of course right to say that it is still, to this day, a legally binding agreement. And of course that must be upheld, not least because international treaties are being picked away at by populists around the world. But, Mr. Speaker, context is everything. And the UN Security Council that he mentions, as we know from the conflict in Syria, for example, is utterly broken. And this can't be resolved in a broken Security Council. So I've been asking the government for years now what proposals it has to see reform of the United Nations Security Council, which will be pivotal in this affair and in much else. And just finally to ask, this issue in Hong Kong is undoubtedly falling prey to international disinformation and misinformation campaigns from China to Russia and many others. What steps is the government taking to support those in Hong Kong to get the truth out to the world?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his remarks and for his support in the approach that we're taking. He made some, I think, valuable points about the joint declaration. It's legally binding, and of course there is always the need to be vigilant to make sure that international treaties are respected on all sides. It's also not just a bilateral arrangement. It reflects wider international human rights obligations, particularly those reflected in the ICCPR on peaceful protest. I don't think that the situation in Hong Kong is analogous particularly to Syria, but I do share his... I know, but he made the reference, but I do share his sense that we need to make the UN work as effectively as possible. We've been out in the UN General Assembly this week. It's been curtailed, as he will know, but these are the kinds of things that we talk about. And of course, China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, so I think it is reasonable and legitimate to expect China to be upholding the values of the United Nations when it comes to Hong Kong.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following directly the point just made by the SNP spokesman, is there any evidence that the Chinese intelligence services, adopting classic communist methodology, are trying to discredit the protesters by infiltrating them with agents provocateurs where the violent fringe is concerned? And will he give special consideration to about 265 former Hong Kong Armed Services members who should in the past have been offered the choice of a British passport, but I believe have yet to receive that offer?
Thank him for his remarks, and I know he follows these issues very carefully. I'm going to be a bit careful about commenting on what is really happening in relation to intelligence services from any other country. But one thing I would say is it's becoming increasingly clear that in relation to some of the counter-protests, that there are criminal gangs involved, and it's not clear entirely what their links may or may not be with the various administrations. I think for our part, we need to play this in a very straight way, which is to say there are some legally binding obligations on the Hong Kong government, and indeed on China, to respect peaceful protests. Frankly, wherever those incursions or erosions or impingements come, we will call them out.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to a written question tabled by my right honourable friend, the member for Orkney and Shetland, ministers have confirmed that UK law enforcement agencies provide training to the Hong Kong police. With that in mind, can I ask the Foreign Secretary, has this training been put through the Overseas Security and Justice Assistance Risk Management System? And if so, what assessment, particularly in light of recent events, has been made of the risk that this training may now be assisting in human rights violations in Hong Kong?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman. Of course, one of the reasons that we might take a judgment in relation to Hong Kong or in anywhere in the world to provide police training is precisely to make sure that it is done in a proportionate way and with some restraint where that's called for. So I wouldn't quite accept the premise that he's argued from. It's true. It's true also, well, we will constantly consider all assessments in relation to this kind of support. He will know that, as the former Foreign Secretary stated during his remarks in the House of Commons on the 25th of June in relation to, for example, crowd control equipment, that no further export licences will be granted for that kind of equipment unless we've got absolutely clear assurances that our concerns around human rights and fundamental freedoms are respected and addressed.
Oh, such illustrious colleagues. It's very hard to choose. Well, Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I ask my honourable friend if he might consider raising an issue with Carrie Lam when he next has a conversation with her, and it's this, which has been raised with me by a number of young people, including the demonstrators, that the social mobility in Hong Kong for the ordinary person is very difficult, even if they've got a good degree, to actually get a job that's well enough paid to better their standard of living from that of their parents.
Thank my honourable friend. He raises a very important point, which is that the protests we're seeing have been fuelled by the economic, social concerns that in any mature democracy would find expression through the democratic institutions. And I think what he's highlighting in a very specific way is why the value of having political dialogue leading to the democratic autonomy that's reflected in the basic law will be important, not just for the individuals raising those issues, but for Hong Kong as an autonomous entity within the one country, two systems model, to be able to address them in a way which is constructive and in the long-term interests of the people of Hong Kong.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All UK citizens' rights and means to travel subject to entry requirements should continue to be protected, and we in these benches call on the Government of China and Hong Kong to facilitate the safe passage of UK citizens when they are compliant with the law. BNO UK passport holders in Hong Kong, however, are not currently recognised by China. But can the Foreign Secretary update the House as to the consular services and support that has been offered to these UK passport holders?
Can I thank the honourable member for that? I mean, we do provide consular assistance to B&O passport holders, but he's right also to talk about the limitations on that status. That was part of the careful balance that I referred to in the remarks I made earlier. What we want to see is on all sides that's respected. That's part of one element, which is part of the one country, two systems model. That's what China advocates. That's what we want respected, but it must be respected on all sides.
A noted sinologist, I think. Mr. Richard Graham.
The 98th anniversary of the Communist Party of China approaches imminently, and there are a range of issues which the Foreign Secretary knows are delicately balanced. One, of course, is the importance of what happens in Taiwan. The second is what is going on in Xinjiang. And the third is the current crisis in Hong Kong. The Foreign Secretary knows that committees in both the Senate and Congress have advanced a new Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which would require an annual assessment to see if Hong Kong is sufficiently autonomous still to justify that city's special trading status with the US. Can my right honourable friend tell the House whether he's discussed this with his US counterparts and whether things are at a stage where Hong Kong's special trading status could be seriously endangered from the situation?
Can I thank him for his remarks? He's raised quite a few questions. Let me just try and address two of them. First of all, in relation to the US legislation, I was in Washington earlier this week, and I had a chance to talk to Congress men on both sides of the aisle about this, and they are making progress in that regard. He also referred to the anniversary that's coming up on the 1st of October, and some of the wider concerns beyond Hong Kong, and he mentioned Xinjiang. We are concerned, as one illustration of the reports, and they're credible reports, of over 1 million people being held in camps against their will. I think there is increasing international concern about that, and about the repressive mistreatment of those people and the impact that has on their international human rights obligations. Again, we make the point China is now a leading member of the international community. It's a P5 member of the Security Council. Very important that those basic international obligations are respected.
Jenny Chapman.
There's a long-standing affinity between many in my constituency and Hong Kong, primarily through family links or because they were posted there during service in the army. There's a particular concern about British national overseas passport holders and the rights that are afforded to them. The Minister has been very clear that he doesn't wish to look at that at the moment because it forms part of the agreement, and there's a logic to that. But would he be prepared to move quickly should there be some variance, shall we say, from that agreement in some other regard, and that their rights may need to be re-examined very, very speedily?
Very careful way and measured way that she's answered that question. Our overarching effort now is in relation to conveying the message from the UK but also the international community that the one country, two system model is respected. That has implications for BNOs, it has implications for autonomy and the right of peaceful protest on Hong Kong. They're all part of the same package. I'm not going to start getting into what will happen if that package is ripped up on the other side, but I do think, particularly given the concerns that the Shadow Minister raised about the question of troop movements and whether or not there might be a major intervention from Beijing, we need to be very clear that that would put at risk the model that China itself has advocated.
Bob Seeley.
Does the Foreign Secretary understand the concerns in this House over the BNOs? China is not trying to abolish the one country, two systems, but it is squeezing it and it is pressuring it. And therefore it is right for us to look at alternatives to the current BNO status. So giving BNOs the right to work in the UK at short notice and potentially a fast track to residency. And on that point, there are also 250 former servicemen in Hong Kong who arguably we have not looked after well enough. And will the Foreign Secretary and this government look at those too? Thank you.
The honourable gentleman. He's right, I think, to say that China is so far respecting the one country, two systems model, and for the large part is trying to respect or seeking to respect, or at least talking about respecting the degree to which it's reflected in the joint declaration. I think as long as we're in that position, then it would be wrong for us to unpick one element of the package, which is the status of BNO nationals. Of course, as the Honourable Lady has mentioned, if it's all reviewed on the side of China, then we would obviously want to think again. But I think for the moment, the right thing to do is to convey to the Chinese government and the administration in Hong Kong why it's in all sides' interest to respect the one country, two systems model.
Louise Haig.
Hong Kong is currently investigating the Chinese state-backed news channel CGTN for its coverage of the Hong Kong protests. I wonder whether the Foreign Secretary has spoken to his DCMS colleagues about that investigation, and particularly about the future of the channel ahead of its launch in London, if it's going to continue to propagate state bias in direct contravention of our broadcasting regulation.
I thank the Honourable Lady. She makes an excellent point, a very powerful way. She'll understand if I respect the role and the remit of Ofcom in this regard, but of course we follow that very closely.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hong Kong is clearly a major financial centre and trading centre. So will my right honourable friend impress upon the Chinese government and the opportunities that arise from having such a vibrant centre, and that anything that prejudices or brings that into question actually damages China as well as damages millions of citizens around the world?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, which is, of course, that it's in the interests of Hong Kong and indeed China to respect the one country, two systems model and the autonomy, both economic and political, that's reflected within it.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As has already been mentioned, the 70th anniversary of the Communist Party is coming up next week, and it's been reported that this could be accompanied by large-scale pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. We've seen the aerial photographs of armoured vehicles lined up, ready to respond. Can I ask, has the UK Government been in touch with its counterparts in China to stress the importance of maintaining a proportionate response and the importance of the rule of law and the protection of human rights throughout what could be a difficult period?
Honourable Lady, and I agree with much of what she said and indeed her concerns, and I can reassure her that I met with Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Bangkok on the 31st of July, and I would have been due to meet him in New York this week, but of course the House is back sitting.
Luke Graham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I welcome some of the comments from my right honourable friend, especially condemning violence but praising peaceful protest. Can I ask him how he can use his offices and our position in the UN to make clear that the Sino-British Declaration is a live international treaty and not a historical document, as many Chinese officials have tried to allude to?
I thank the honourable gentleman. He's absolutely right, and I think it is widely accepted that this was an international agreement. It is binding under international law, and whilst there may be some who call that into question, I don't think it's in the interests of anyone in Hong Kong, in China, and for our part, the United Kingdom, to call that into question. And that is something with which I think there is widespread agreement amongst our international partners.
Dr. David Drew.
Mr. Speaker, those of us with friends in Hong Kong know how difficult it is now for people to go about their ordinary lives, that businesses are being affected. Doesn't it behove the responsibility of the whole international community now to try and settle these disputes before it gets even worse?
Yes.
Bill Grant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that the latest developments we witness in Hong Kong are part of a wider trend of civil and political freedoms being reduced over time? And what actions can the UK take to halt or indeed reverse such a trend?
Well, we can make our position clear, both to the administration in Hong Kong. We make our position clear to my Chinese opposite number. The Prime Minister and all members of the government do. We also need to work with our international partners to look very carefully at this situation and make sure that we're sending and telegraphing as clear and as broad a signal to the administration in Beijing, the government in Beijing, about our concerns that he rightly raises.
Paul Sweeney.
The comments the honourable friend member for Auckland South Perthshire made about the situation, the Chinese side repudiating the joint declaration. Would the Foreign Secretary consider making it clear to the Chinese side that there is disquiet in this House about the status of BNO nationals, and if they continue to repudiate that agreement, that international treaty, this House would consider revisions to the 1985 Hong Kong Act and extend full citizenship to BNO nationals as a potential measure?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman. I don't think that the point right now is to issue threats to the government of China. What we do need to do is be very clear, both as the UK but with our international partners, that we want to respect the one country, two systems, and that some of the things that we're seeing both in Hong Kong but also some of the concerns that have been expressed on all sides of the House about the military build-up of troops on the Chinese side of the border would put that at risk.
Sir Philip Dunn.
Not actually, sir. But thank you for elevating me, Mr. Speaker.
Well, apologise to the right honourable gentleman who's a member of the Privy Council. I had thought that he had that additional honour, but I think it's only a matter of time, and if I've moved it on a bit, well, then that is surely a positive thing. For now, Mr. Philip Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to my right honourable friend that I lived in Hong Kong for a period of years, including over the political transition, so I feel particularly acutely the pressures on the people illegitimately protesting there, and I welcome the concerns across the House about the way that's being handled by the Hong Kong authorities. Although it was over 20 years ago, I'm acutely aware of the very strong and close trading and financial links between this country and Hong Kong. And can I ask my right honourable friend, what can he do to ensure that business confidence is maintained, to ensure that Hong Kong remains the vibrant financial centre which is so important in international trade?
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend? He's absolutely right about this. Of course, the first and foremost responsibility for respecting the stability and the economic vibrancy of Hong Kong is with the Hong Kong administration and, of course, more generally with the government in China. But what we wish to do and will seek to do, both at the level of business, civil society and in our conduct and dealings with both the Hong Kong administration and the Chinese government, is to be very clear on where we think their interests lie and the risks of undermining the autonomy and its economic autonomy as well as political autonomy, which touches on the issues that he raises.
Dear House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There have been widespread reports that crowd control equipment is being used against protesters that violates their human rights. In his answer that he gave earlier to my right honourable friend and the member of Streatham, he said that export licences would not be granted in respect of crowd control equipment from the UK to Hong Kong unless assurances are given that human rights will not be violated. Is he therefore saying he has asked for those assurances and they have indeed been given?
What I'm saying is we have a system for export licence control which is rigorous and robust, one of the best in the world, and we will keep it constantly under review. And yes, that does mean we monitor and listen to what the officials on the other side are saying in relation to importing those goods, but fundamentally we take an objective and independent assessment to make sure the UK rules are respected.
Steve Dowell.
Mr. Speaker, I was going to ask the Foreign Secretary about the position with BNO passport holders, but he's already answered many questions on that, but just want to put my support that we do all we can for BNO passport holders. But can I also ask him what assessment he has made of the treatment of religious minorities in Hong Kong by the Chinese authorities, and will he ensure that this government does everything it can not only to support the civil and political freedoms of the people of Hong Kong, but also religious liberty there?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. And I have also, just to say and put on the record, had conversations, and I know the Home Secretary is very appraised of the situation of BO nationals, so it is something that we have discussed and keep under review. He rightly raises the issue of freedom of religion, and I think there's a broader issue around freedom of belief and conscience. We're concerned about the persecution of religious groups in China on the grounds of religion or belief. We're concerned that the Chinese government guidelines restricting unapproved religious activity, education and travel would restrict the peaceful observation of those rights, which are of course guaranteed under international human rights instruments.
Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And building on the response that the Foreign Secretary has just made to my honourable friend, the confidence of the people of Hong Kong is undermined in the intentions of the Chinese government by the clear evidence of the violation of human rights, especially in the area of freedom of religion or belief, or the exercise of conscience, as he described it. Can the Foreign Secretary be specific about what representations Her Majesty's government have made to the Chinese government about the 1 million Muslims that are being held in re-education camps?
Thank my honourable friend. We raised this in the United Nations. I've been very clear on the UK's position, which is we are very concerned about that. The reports look credible and they look like they violate the most basic undertakings under international human rights law, and we'll continue to make sure that those concerns are expressed very directly and candidly. We want a friendship and a partnership with the government of China. I've said that to the Chinese Foreign Minister, but with all good friendships you must be able to talk candidly where you have concerns.
Thank you. Order. Urgent question. Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for International Trade if she will make an urgent statement on the recent unlawful award of armed export licences to Saudi Arabia in contravention of a Court of Appeal ruling that determined that the UK must cease arms exports to the country.
Mr. Speaker, today I will be laying a written ministerial statement updating Parliament on the latest situation in relation to the undertaking given to the Court of Appeal on the 20th of June about export licences to Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners. As the Government informed the Court on the 16th of September and followed up with an affidavit today, my department identified errors that had taken place in the export licensing procedure in relation to the Saudi coalition's activities in the conflict in Yemen. As I stated publicly on the 16th of September, I unreservedly apologise for the export licences that my department issued in error. I have also given my unreserved apologies to the Court. A procedure to ensure that export licences were not granted for goods for Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners for possible use in the conflict in Yemen was put in place on the 20th of June 2019. This followed the court order and the then Secretaries of State's statement to Parliament. The Export Control Joint Unit subsequently issued export licences to Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners, and in line with the agreed procedure, these were signed off at official rather than ministerial level. It subsequently came to light that 2 licences were in breach of the court undertaking, and 1 licence was granted contrary to the statement in Parliament, as these licences were for goods that could possibly be used in the conflict in Yemen. Without seeking to prejudice the independent investigation, it appears that information pertaining to the conflict had not been fully shared across government. As soon as the issue was brought to my attention on the 12th of September, I took immediate action, taking immediate steps to inform the Court and Parliament, putting in place immediate interim procedures to make sure the errors could not happen again, instigating a complete and full internal review of all licences granted for Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners since the 20th of June, and the DIT Permanent Secretary commissioning on my behalf a full internal investigation. Court and Parliament were informed on the 16th of September with the appropriate detail. And the interim procedures mean that senior officials in DIT, FCO and MOD guarantee the latest information available to government is used in their advice. All recommendations to grant licences for the export of items for Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners will now be referred to ministers rather than being signed off at official level. The full review of licences for Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners is currently being undertaken, and this internal review is still ongoing. As a result of the internal review so far, we have identified 1 further licence that has been granted in breach of the undertaking given to the Court of Appeal. This licence has not been used and has now been revoked. My officials are also carrying out an urgent review of the composition of the coalition. This has identified a further licence which is in breach of the parliamentary statement. We have reassessed the licence in light of the latest information and subsequently revoked it insofar as it applies to Jordan. My officials are continuing to review all the information relating to licences granted to Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners since the 20th of June 2019, and we will be open and transparent with the Court and Parliament as to any new issues that emerge. In addition, the DIT Permanent Secretary has commissioned on my behalf a full independent investigation. This will establish the precise circumstances in which these licences were granted, establish whether any other licences have been granted in breach of the undertaking to the court or contrary to the parliamentary statement, and confirm that procedures are in place so that no further breaches of the undertaking can occur. This investigation will be led by an independent senior official, the Director General of Policy Group for the Department of Work and Pensions. It is possible that more cases will come to light. As I have done so far, I will keep the Court and Parliament informed as to any new information that emerges.
Mr. Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the response given by the Secretary of State and the shocking revelation that 2 further extra licences would be breaking the law and that further may yet to be discovered. But I welcome, however, her unreserved apologies for the errors, as it has been called so far. The situation in Yemen is currently the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world, with half the country's population at risk of famine and 22 million Yemenis in need of aid and protection. While the UK has given £770 million in aid to Yemen over the past 5 years, it has earned 8 times more from arms sales to Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners. This is not the result of a so-called inadvertent error, but of a shamefully incoherent foreign policy that has put profit ahead of upholding international humanitarian law. The UK has licensed £4.6 billion worth of arms to Saudi military, a military that has been found directly accountable by the UN for an estimated 10,852 civilian casualties as of November last year. And now, despite the Court of Appeal ruling that UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia were unlawful, the Secretary of State has approved arms export licences to the Royal Saudi Land Forces. The Secretary of State has said that, and I quote, "The fact that RSLF troops were deployed in Yemen at the same time the licence was issued, this licence should not have been granted." How could this ever have been in any doubt that the RSLF were in Yemen, given that they make up over half of the Saudi armed forces, and the Saudi armed forces have invaded Yemen by land? It's crystal clear. The process which led to these licences being granted demonstrates the same carelessness and utter lack of regard for human life that's defined the UK's arms sales to Saudi over these years. Rather than wasting time and money appealing the court decision or lobbying other foreign governments to resume weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, will the Secretary of State now rescind these unlawfully granted arms export licences? Furthermore, does she take full responsibility for the Department's unlawful award of arms export licences in contravention of the Court of Appeal, and therefore will she do the right thing and resign?
Secretary of State.
Clearly, the conflict in Yemen is a very concerning situation, and we fully support the UN-led process to reach peaceful resolution. And as the honourable member mentioned, we contribute £770 million of UK aid. But what we are talking about today is specific procedural issues in terms of the issuance of export licences. We have a procedure that follows the consolidated criteria that is very clear around humanitarian law. And in their judgment on the 20th of June, the Court of Appeal is very clear that we have in place a rigorous and robust process. The issue is how that process has been followed. And this is why, when I was first informed of this issue on the 12th of September, as Secretary of State, I took immediate action to have an internal investigation into what had happened, to ask the Permanent Secretary to get another leader from another government department to fully investigate the process and to make sure no such licences could be issued in error by putting in place a robust process. At the same time, I took immediate steps to inform Court and Parliament. I've been completely open and transparent about what has happened. But the issue here is a procedural issue, And I don't want to prejudge the investigation, but the issue appears to be the sharing of information across government, which is why senior officials will now be asked to sign off on the advice that is put forward, and ministers will be asked to sign off these export licences.
Order. It might be helpful to colleagues if I indicate that, whilst wishing to accommodate the legitimate and not inconsiderable interest in this urgent question, I want also to move on to the next urgent question at or close to midday. Therefore, there is a premium upon brevity from back and front benches alike. Mr. Philip Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I say to my right honourable friend that I think everyone across this House shares the views that she's expressed about the significance and the horror of the humanitarian situation in Yemen. I think what she is expressing to the House today is quite proper remorse to ensure that the government follows the procedures for arms exports that are well established in this country. But could I ask her to reflect on the fact that only yesterday we were debating in this House the impact on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia from their neighbours across the Gulf, the Iranian attack on oil facilities in that country. This is a very sensitive area. One of our key allies in the Gulf is under considerable pressure from the Iranian authorities, and as a government we need to act responsibly to ensure that we stand by our allies when they come under attack.
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point. The topic, however, of today's question is about the following of the procedures in the consolidated criteria. The consolidated criteria are right. That is a good way of looking at making sure that we are issuing export licences to the right parties. The problem here is specifically whether that process was followed correctly within government and whether information was shared between government departments. That is the issue we have identified. I've taken immediate steps to make sure that information is properly shared when those decisions are taken, as well as investigating what went wrong with those processes being followed. But of course, I take full responsibility as Secretary of State, and I have made an unreserved apology both to court and to Parliament.
Order. Enviable eloquence to be equalled by breathtaking brevity. Mr. Barry Gardner.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker. They did know. The government did know. They just didn't tell the Secretary of State's department.
Yeah.
Which department knew? Which minister had the responsibility to tell the Secretary of State? And why are they not sitting alongside her making an apology to Parliament?
Yes.
The evidence presented during the court proceedings earlier this year and the recent revelation proves that the government has failed to abide by its own undertaking. On 2 occasions since the Court of Appeal's verdict, licences have been awarded in contravention of the determination precisely because a careful assessment had not been carried out. I'd ask the Minister to confirm the extent to which the reports that were made in 2015, the widespread reports that Saudi troops had been deployed on the ground and were leading the coordinated efforts of coalition forces in Yemeni territory, why were those reports not properly investigated and assessed by her department? I note her letter to the Committee on Arms Export Control that the inference is that no such investigation had ever been carried out. Now, her predecessor advised that there were a number of ways that they monitor potential breaches, one of which was the ground military and diplomatic staff through our positive close relations with the Saudi Arabian officials. The Saudi Arabian officials must have known that their own troops were on the ground. So why did this fail to communicate in the close positive relations that our staff had with them? I welcome the fact that the Secretary of State has launched a full inquiry, but it won't have escaped her notice that just a short while ago the arms export fair took place in London. £6.3 billion of arms exports have been exported to the coalition by this government, 5.3 to Saudi Arabia. What further deals were done there? And given that she said it is possible that more illegal deals may have taken place, does she actually think that instead of it being possible, that is highly probable?
Well, the honourable gentleman asked me first of all about the process that took place within government. The answer is the joint unit is staffed by officials from the Ministry of Defence, the Foreign Office and the Department of International Trade. And there clearly was a failing in terms of sharing information across government. We are conducting an investigation which is being conducted by a Director General at the Department of Work and Pensions, looking precisely at the question of which department issued the information or did not issue the information, how was that shared? And that will be put forward in due course. It's very important. This is a complex area. The Export Controls Unit approve approximately 16,000 licences per year. So it is important that we get this right and we don't rush to an answer before we are ready to do so. In terms of the consolidated criteria on licensing, it's also important, of course, that we adhere to the terms of our undertaking to the court and our statement to Parliament. And what I was talking about earlier was specifically breaches of our undertaking to court and of our statement to Parliament.
Sir George Hollingberry.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. This is clearly a matter of serious moment, and I welcome the tone that the Secretary of State has taken today, and indeed her admission that things have not gone right. Can she assure me of two things? First, that there is a full and complete investigation going on, and I think she's talked to that already, but particularly the aim of this investigation will not just be to find out how this happened, but to ensure that it cannot happen again.
Well, I can assure my honourable friend that, first of all, I have put in place an interim procedure to make sure there is sign-off from senior officials within all three relevant departments and ministerial sign-off as well on any proposed export licences to the relevant parties. And secondly, that we are conducting this investigation, which will be led by a Director General from the Department of Work and Pensions, into exactly what went wrong in this case to make sure it cannot happen again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I recognise the Secretary of State's apology and welcome it, and her acceptance of responsibility, which I also welcome. I'd also say it's true that the breaches in the export licences which form this urgent question may well be described, as she said, as procedural. But this case highlights some profound problems with her department. Spare parts for armoured vehicles used by Saudi land forces, spare parts for military radio used by Saudi land forces, which form half of the Saudi military, which were operating on the ground in Yemen when the licences were issued, which formed part of the invasion by land into the Yemen, from a country, Saudi Arabia, found to be in breach of international humanitarian law, which is precisely what is supposed to be checked before licences are granted. So can the Secretary of State tell us, was the provision of incomplete information shared across government a simple incompetence? Was her department and others not aware of their responsibilities in this regard? And can I say, she'll have to be convincing, because I'm not convinced the actions being taken so far remove the perception that this government and this department are prepared to ignore the law, in this case from the Court of Appeal, when it suits them to do so.
The Court of Appeal were very clear in their judgment that there is a rigorous and robust process in place across government. The question is about the specific sharing of information between government departments. I have absolute confidence that the unit, when they receive information, implement that in doing their work. The issue is the sharing of information. And this is why we have conducted an internal review into the licences already issued, as well as asking another government department to look across the board at where information was shared. But this is not an issue about the process, which was deemed by the Court of Appeal to be rigorous and robust. This is about how that process has been followed. And there are a lot of people saying, well, why can't we do this quicker? It is very important we get this right. And in the interim period, I have put in place a procedure
買屋有冇有買屋？ 解決，係要解散警隊，解散警隊，解散警隊，解散警隊。獨立調查委員會係冇判決權嘅，而家佢哋嘅罪行啊係好犀利㗎，兩國交戰係唔俾打戰俘，打仗啦兩國，個戰俘都唔俾打。解散警隊啦！解散警隊！